They called her worthless. They stripped her of everything, her home, her dignity, her 7 years of sacrifice, and threw her into the rain like she was nothing. But the woman the Kwan family discarded, she came back as the one thing they never saw coming. If you've ever been underestimated, abandoned, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. This is The Silent King's Wife, and it begins on the worst night of Zara Whitfield's life. The rain came down in sheets, not the soft kind that makes Seoul look like a painting in the tourist photographs. This was the kind of rain that meant business, cold, relentless, coming in sideways off the Han River and cutting straight through wool and skin and whatever dignity a person had left. The kind of rain that didn't care who you were or what you'd sacrificed or how many years you'd spent building something you believed in. Zara Whitfield stood on the sidewalk outside the Kwan family compound, and she couldn't feel her fingers. She wasn't sure when that had happened. Somewhere between the moment Ethan's mother had placed the signed divorce papers on the mahogany dining table, the same table where Zara had spent 7 years eating meals she didn't always love, speaking a language she'd bled to learn, sitting up perfectly straight because the Kwan family expected perfection in everything. And this moment, standing in the dark with a single rolling suitcase beside her, she had lost the feeling in her hands. The iron gate behind her was already closed. She hadn't heard it close. That was the part that would stay with her for a long time afterward. She hadn't heard it. She'd been looking at the lights in the upper windows of the compound, the warm amber glow she used to think meant safety, and then the gate had simply shut, smooth and silent on its hydraulic hinges. And that sound, or that absence of sound, was the loneliest thing she'd ever experienced in 30 years of living. Her phone had 11% battery left. She'd been calling Ethan's number for the past 20 minutes. He hadn't answered. She wasn't surprised. What surprised her was that her body kept doing it anyway, kept pressing the screen, kept holding the phone up, kept expecting something different, even as the rational part of her brain already knew, already understood, had probably understood for longer than she wanted to admit. She put the phone in her coat pocket and looked at the street. Seoul's Gangnam district at 11:30 on a Thursday night had a particular energy, the kind of city that never fully slept, never fully quieted, but at this hour settled into something lower and more private. Restaurants still lit, convenience stores humming with fluorescent cold, a few taxis moving through the rain with their roof lights on, red glowing dots sliding past her like they were in a different world entirely. She'd arrived in this city at 23 years old. She'd come for love. That was the embarrassing truth of it, the part she never said out loud to anyone anymore because the word felt too small and too enormous at the same time. She had come for Ethan Kwan, who she'd met in New York during his graduate year at Columbia, who had looked at her across a crowded university library with an expression she'd never seen on anyone's face before. Not like he was surprised she existed, not like he was calculating what she could offer him, but like he'd been waiting for something and had just recognized what it was. She'd been 22. He'd been 26. He'd been brilliant and quiet and occasionally funny in a way that snuck up on you, and he'd held her hand on the subway like it was the most natural thing in the world, and she had believed him. She had believed every single thing about him. 7 years. She'd spent 7 years in that compound. She'd learned Korean, not tourist Korean, not phrasebook Korean, but real Korean, the complicated kind with its layers of formality and its impossible verb endings and its particular music. She'd learned it because she'd wanted his family to know she was serious. She'd learned it because she'd wanted to belong. She'd spent 2 years achieving fluency and had never once been thanked for it by anyone in the Kwan household. Ethan's mother, Mrs. Kwon Soo-yeon, had simply switched to speaking Korean around her once Zara understood it, finding new ways to say things in Zara's presence that she clearly intended Zara to hear. The suitcase had one broken wheel. She'd noticed it when the housekeeper, Mrs. Park, who had at least been unable to meet Zara's eyes while she helped pack, had brought it down from storage. The left rear wheel was cracked. It wobbled and caught on every uneven piece of pavement, creating a rhythmic stuttering sound as Zara pulled it behind her. She had no destination. That was the part her brain couldn't process cleanly. She had a Korean bank account with the equivalent of approximately 4,000 American dollars in it. Her personal spending account, separate from the household accounts she'd lost access to this afternoon at 4:30 p.m., when Mrs. Kwan had apparently made a call. She had her American passport, which she'd been smart enough to keep in her personal documents folder and not in the household safe where Ethan had suggested she store it years ago. She had a change of clothes, some jewelry that was hers by origin and therefore presumably hers to keep, and a phone with 11, now 9% battery. She did not have a flight booked. She did not have a hotel room. She did not have, she realized with a slow, sick drop in her stomach, a single friend in soul who was truly, unconditionally hers. The women she'd socialized with for 7 years were the wives and daughters of the Kwan family's associates. She'd understood that on some level the whole time. You understood things like that when you were Black and American in a world where you were perpetually the outsider who had to be twice as careful and half as loud to be accepted at all. She'd understood it, and she'd worked within it, and she told herself that was enough, that belonging to the edges of something was still belonging. The rain picked up. She stood there on the sidewalk getting wet because she couldn't make herself start walking yet, and she thought about her mother in Baltimore, who had said, the last time they'd spoken freely before things got complicated, "Zara, baby, you are someone's answer. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're someone's problem." Her mother had been dead for 4 years. Ovarian cancer, fast and without mercy. Zara had flown back for the funeral, and Ethan had come with her, and he had held her hand in the airport and through the service and at the graveside, and she had thought, even in the worst moment of her life up to that point, at least I have this. At least I have him. She pulled out her phone and opened the Maps application. Nearest hotel, budget. She started walking. The broken wheel caught on a crack in the pavement, and the suitcase tipped sideways, and for one long moment, Zara just stood over it. Looked at it lying on the wet sidewalk in the rain. The impulse that moved through her then was not grief, not yet. It was something colder and more specific. It was rage, and she recognized it for what it was. And she breathed it in for a second before she picked the suitcase up and kept moving. She'd been trying to give the Kwan family a child for 4 years. That was the arithmetic of her humiliation, laid out clean and cold. 4 years of fertility treatments, of early mornings and hormone injections, and the particular cruelty of hope followed by its absence, followed again by hope. 4 years of doctors' offices and medical language, and Ethan sitting beside her in the waiting rooms with his jaw tight and his eyes forward, saying the right things but somehow present in a way that felt increasingly transactional. 4 years of Mrs. Kwan asking questions at Sunday dinners that weren't really questions. Have the doctors found any progress? The family needs to think about the future, you understand. Ethan's cousin's wife just announced her second pregnancy, delivered with a smile that was technically a smile. The Kwan family had a bloodline they considered important. That was the word they used. Bloodline. As if they were talking about racehorses. As if Zara were a mare who had failed to produce its stud. She'd tried to explain once to Ethan what it felt like to sit at that table every week. He'd gotten defensive. He'd said his mother meant well. He'd said Zara was being sensitive. He'd said that. Sensitive. She'd been fighting her body for 4 years, living in a house where she was assessed weekly on her reproductive value, and her husband had told her she was being sensitive. She saw the lights of a convenience store and ducked inside to get out of the rain for a moment. The young man behind the counter glanced at her and then looked back at his phone. She was just a wet woman, nothing notable. She stood in the warmth between the snack racks and stared at her phone screen and tried to construct a plan. The hotel nearest to her was 3 subway stops away and had rooms available starting at $82,001 per night. She could manage that for now. She could manage maybe a week. After a week, she needed to either go home, and the word home had no traction in her mind anymore, had been slowly emptying of meaning for the past several years, or she needed to figure something else out. She bought a bottle of water. She drank half of it standing in the convenience store. The young man did not look at her again. Outside, the rain had not let up. She found the subway entrance 2 blocks down and descended into the fluorescent underground of Seoul, dragging the broken-wheeled suitcase down the stairs 1 step at a time. The platform at this hour was quiet. A businessman asleep on a bench. 2 young women in matching sneakers who glanced at Zara and then away, unselfconsciously, the way people in cities learn to look at strangers. Zara sat on a bench and looked at her reflection in the black subway window across the tracks. She looked, she thought, like someone who had recently had something removed from them. Not injured exactly, not visibly broken, but hollowed in a particular way. Her face was composed because she was still holding herself together on the outside, the way you hold a cracked cup by not squeezing it. The mascara she'd been wearing for the dinner she'd attended last night, the dinner where Ethan's mother had laid the papers on the table while Ethan sat 3 feet away and said nothing, had tracked down one cheekbone, and she hadn't known until she saw it now in the dark reflection. She wiped it with her thumb. The train came. She found the hotel, checked in, was given a room on the 6th floor that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and had a single window overlooking an alley. She sat on the edge of the bed with her coat still on and let herself be still for the first time in hours. The room was 12 feet wide at most. The walls were the color of old cream. Through the window she could see rain moving in the alley lights. She did not cry. She wanted to note that about herself. She'd expected to, had braced for it. The full collapse, the loss of structural integrity, the kind of weeping that makes your chest hurt for days afterward. But it didn't come. What came instead was a kind of carbonated fury, small and persistent, moving through her bloodstream in a way that was almost useful. She sat with it and let it be there. She thought about Ethan's face when his mother had put the papers down. He had not looked at Zara. He'd looked at the table. His jaw had been working slightly, like he was chewing something, and his hands had been flat on the mahogany, and he had not looked at his wife across the table. Not once, not when Zara had said his name. Just his name, one syllable, Ethan. And not when Zara had pushed her chair back and stood up. He had chosen the table over her face. That was what she'd think about later, not the words his mother had said, not the papers themselves, but Ethan choosing to look at the table rather than at her when it was happening. Like if he didn't see it directly, it wasn't entirely real. Like he could protect himself from the knowledge of what he was doing by simply not looking. She took off her coat. She lay back on the bed. She stared at the water stain on the ceiling that someone had painted over but not fixed, the brown ghost of it still visible under the white. Her phone rang. She sat up. The screen said, Ethan. She looked at it for 3 full rings. Her thumb moved toward the screen twice and stopped. On the 4th ring, she picked up. Zara. His voice was low. She could hear the particular quality of it that meant he was somewhere he could be overheard, speaking at a register designed to carry only as far as necessary. I just wanted to make sure you found somewhere to stay. She let the silence sit for a moment. Let it be as wide as she wanted it to be. Don't, she said finally. Her voice came out level. She was surprised by that. Don't do that. You just wanted to feel better, she said. That's not the same thing as caring about where I sleep. That's not fair. Ethan, she stopped, started again. Your mother handed me divorce papers across the table and you looked at the table. For 20 minutes you looked at the table. Don't call me to feel better about that. I'm not available for that right now. A pause. She heard him breathe. I'm sorry, he said. I know that doesn't... No, she said. It doesn't. She hung up. The phone lay on the bedspread. She looked at it for a moment and then turned it face down. The fury was still there, and she was almost grateful for it because she knew what was behind it. The grief, the real grief, the kind that would take years and not hours. And she wasn't ready for that yet. The fury was a door she could hold shut for now. She was going to hold it shut. She was in the middle of that thought. Sitting on the edge of a hotel bed in Seoul with 9% battery left and no plan and a broken-wheeled suitcase when the notification came through on her phone. Not a call. An email. She almost didn't check it, almost left it for morning. But something, some reflex, some instinct she didn't have a name for yet, made her turn the phone over. The email had no subject line. The sender address was a string of numbers she didn't recognize. The body of the email was 6 words. I know what they did to you. Zara stared at the screen. Below the text was an address, a location in Gangnam, 3 blocks from the Kwon compound, and a time. Tomorrow morning. 7 a.m. She read it 3 times. Her heart was moving faster than it should. She looked at the sender address again, the anonymous string of numbers, giving nothing away. She looked at the 6 words. She thought about how many people in Seoul knew what had happened tonight, what the Kwon family had done, and considered the probability that this was something designed to exploit her in some new way, to extract from her whatever scraps of value she had left. She thought about all of that, and then she looked at the address again, and something in her, not naivete, not desperation, but something harder and more deliberate, decided. She set an alarm for 6:15. She lay back on the bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She was at the address at 6:58. It was a coffee house, not the kind that catered to tourists, but a real one, narrow and dark-wooded, the kind of place where the espresso machine was older than the staff and the chairs didn't match. She went in and took a table near the back wall because 30 years of being the most visible person in any room had trained her to put solid things behind her. She ordered black coffee she didn't drink. She watched the door. At exactly 7 o'clock, a man walked in. She'd seen powerful men before. She'd lived inside the Kwon family's world for 7 years, had attended dinners and events and corporate galas where powerful men filled the room with their certainty, their rehearsed ease, their particular talent for making the space around them feel occupied rather than shared. She knew what that looked like. She knew the signals. This was something different. He was tall, not remarkably so, but the way he held himself made the room adjust around him rather than the other way around. Dark coat, no visible label. He had the kind of face that age had improved rather than simply marked, sharp, unhurried, with eyes that moved across the coffee house in a single long sweep before landing on her, and then not moving again. He walked to her table and sat down across from her without asking if she was Zara Whitfield or whether the seat was available. He simply sat, like the chair was already his, and looked at her the way very few people had ever looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not at the version of her that was useful to them, but directly at her, like she was a problem he found genuinely interesting. "I ordered coffee," she said. "I don't know if you want anything." "I don't drink it," he said. His English was accented but precise, each word placed with the care of someone who had learned the language as a discipline rather than an accident. "I'm Kang Min-jae." She knew the name. Everyone in Seoul's upper circles knew the name, or knew of it, or knew the particular quality of quiet that entered a room when someone said it. She had heard it mentioned twice in the Kwon household, both times in lowered voices. She had not until this moment connected it to anything that touched her life. "You sent the email," she said. "Yes." "You know what happened last night?" "I've known about your situation for longer than last night," he said. He said it without apology, without the softening qualifiers that people usually deployed when they were admitting to something uncomfortable. Just the fact, clean and direct. "The Kwon family has been on my radar for some time." "Why?" "That's a longer conversation." "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She held the look without flinching, which apparently was something he'd been assessing, because something in his expression shifted slightly. Not warmth, nothing as legible as that, but a recalibration. Like she'd answered a question he hadn't asked aloud. "The Kwon family has spent 15 years building a business empire on the foundation of other people's destruction," he said. "Falsified contracts, corporate espionage, at least 2 situations involving coercion that the right people have spent considerable money keeping buried." He paused. "I have the documentation. What I have needed is a structural entry point, someone with intimate knowledge of the family's internal operations, their relationships, their pressure points." Zara was quiet for a moment. "You want to use me," she said. "Yes," he said, simply. No performance of offense at the word. "At least you're honest about it." "I find dishonesty inefficient." She looked at him across the table. The coffee house was beginning to fill around them, the morning commuter crowd filtering in, and nobody looked at their table twice, which she suspected was not an accident, suspected that Kang Min-jae had chosen this place specifically for that reason, because even the location had been calculated. "What exactly are you proposing?" she said. He reached into his coat and placed a single card on the table between them. It had an address on it and nothing else. "Come to that address this evening," he said. "I'll explain in full." what I'm asking for, what I'm offering, what the risk to you is, and how I intend to manage it. He stood up. The Kwan family discarded you last night. They believe they are finished with you. A pause. The unhurried eyes looked at her one more time. I want to give you the opportunity to remind them that they made a mistake. He walked out. Zara looked at the card on the table. She looked at it for a long time. Outside, Seoul was waking up. The traffic building, the morning light coming in gray and persistent through the coffeehouse windows. The city indifferent to the fact that a woman sitting alone at a back table was holding a decision in her hands that she couldn't fully see the shape of yet. She picked up the card. She didn't know yet what Kang Min-jae really was. Didn't know what he was holding back, what he'd already decided, what the architecture of his plan looked like in the parts he hadn't shown her. She would find all of that out later, in ways that would cost her something. But in that moment, in that coffeehouse, with the broken-wheeled suitcase waiting for her back at the hotel and Ethan's silence still living in her chest like a splinter, she made a choice. She put the card in her coat pocket. And for the first time since the gate had closed behind her in the rain, Zara Whitfield felt something she hadn't expected to feel so soon. She felt curious. The address on the card led her to a building that didn't advertise itself. That was the first thing she noticed. No signage, no company name etched into the lobby glass, no reception desk with a smiling attendant and a visitor log. Just a tower of dark glass in the quieter end of Gangnam, the kind of building that existed in the background of photographs and never in the foreground. And a private elevator that required a card she hadn't been given, but that opened anyway when she approached it, which meant someone had been watching for her arrival, which meant she had been expected with more precision than she found comfortable. The elevator went to the 31st floor. The doors opened into a room that was not what she'd built in her head during the cab ride over. She'd constructed something cold, she realized, something deliberately intimidating, steel and shadow, the aesthetic of a man who wanted you to feel small before he spoke to you. What she walked into instead was a space that felt like a library that had forgotten to put in the books. Floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides. The Han River visible to the west, catching the last gray light of the afternoon. Low furniture and dark leather. A long table with nothing on it. Plants? Real ones, not decorative fakes. In the corners, which struck her as strange enough to note. Min-jae was standing at the window with his back to her. He didn't turn immediately. She got the sense this wasn't a power move, or not only a power move, but that he was genuinely finishing a thought, the way some people needed a few extra seconds to close a door before they opened another one. When he did turn, he was holding nothing. No phone, no file, no prop. Just his hands loose at his sides, and that same quality of attention she'd felt in the coffee house, directed at her like a narrow beam. "You came," he said. "I said I wasn't going anywhere," she said. "People say things in the morning that they reconsider by evening." He moved to the table and pulled out a chair, not in the performative way of a man who wanted credit for manners, but practically, like a person who understood the mechanics of a difficult conversation required people to be seated. "Sit down. This will take a while." She sat. She kept her coat on. She put her bag on the floor beside her and not on the table, which was a small choice but a conscious one. She wanted both hands free. He sat across from her, close enough that the table between them wasn't a barrier so much as a surface, something neutral they were both adjacent to. He opened a folder she hadn't seen him retrieve and placed it between them without pushing it toward her, leaving the choice of whether to look at it entirely in her hands. She looked at it. Photographs, documents, bank transfer records with long strings of numbers and account names she recognized. Not all of them, but enough. The Kwan family's name appeared on the third page, and beside it a corporate entity she'd heard Ethan mention once, in passing, on a phone call she'd been present for and immediately made clear she wasn't listening to, because that was what 7 years in that house had trained her to do. Be present without witnessing, exist without observing. She'd been an excellent wife, she thought with a cold clarity. She had trained herself almost out of personhood for these people. The Kwan Group's construction arm, Min-jae said, watching her read, has been operating a contract falsification scheme for 11 years. They win municipal bids using projected costs that are fraudulent from submission. The overruns are absorbed by subsidiary companies that exist solely to receive them. He said this the way someone describes weather, not indifferent to it, but factual, because facts were the appropriate register. 3 public infrastructure projects in the past 4 years. 2 of them are currently under structural review that the family has been paying to delay. Zara looked up. How long have you had this? The documentation? 18 months? The knowledge? A pause. Longer. And you haven't used it. I've been waiting for the right entry point, he said, as I told you this morning. Me, she said. You. She looked back at the folder. She turned another page. There was a photograph of a meeting, taken from above, through what appeared to be a tinted glass ceiling, the angle suggesting a concealed camera, showing Ethan's father, who had been dead for 3 years, sitting across from 2 men she didn't recognize, and a third man whose face was partially obscured but whose posture and the particular set of his shoulders were familiar to her in a way she couldn't immediately name. Who's the third man? She said. Min-jae was quiet for exactly 1 beat too long. That question, he said, is part of the longer conversation. She closed the folder. She put her hands flat on the table, not aggressive, just present, and looked at him directly. I'm going to need you to stop doing that, she said. Doing what? Parceling information like it's a resource you're managing. I'm not a hostile negotiation. I'm a person sitting across from you trying to decide whether to trust you with what's left of my life right now, and every time you hold something back, I become less likely to do that. She kept her voice level. It cost her something to keep it level, but she paid it. So tell me what you're actually proposing, all of it, or I take a cab back to a hotel room and figure out a different way forward. Something moved in his face. Not quite surprise. She didn't think this was a man who surprised easily, but something that might have been reassessment. He leaned back slightly in the chair, and she got the sense that this too was a genuine response rather than a calculated one. A public marriage, he said. She let the words sit there. You and I marry, he continued, legally, formally, with a ceremony substantial enough to generate the coverage we need. We become a visible couple in the circles where the Kwan family operates. You have 7 years of intimate knowledge of that family's social architecture. Who trusts whom? Who fears whom? Which relationships are genuine and which are performance? I have the financial documentation and the structural means to dismantle their business interests. Together, we have something neither of us has alone. He paused. A complete weapon. And when it's over, she said, divorce on terms you dictate. Financial settlement, documentation that protects your interests going forward. He said it without flourish, like a contractor reading out materials costs. I don't expect you to perform affection or pretend to something you don't feel. I'm not asking for that. What are you asking for? Your presence, your knowledge, your willingness to walk back into the world these people built and make them look at what they threw away. Zara was quiet. The river outside had gone dark, just the lights on the bridges reflected in it now, orange and white. The city doing what the city always did, enormous and unmoved by any single person's crisis. You said this morning that you've known about my situation for longer than last night, she said. How long? A pause. 2 years. 2 years. She repeated it not as a question, but to hear it in her own voice, to test the weight of it. You've known what was happening to me in that house for 2 years, and you're only here now. I needed you in a position where you had reason to act, he said. He said it without flinching. I couldn't approach you while you were still inside the family structure. You wouldn't have moved. You waited until I had nothing left. Yes. The word hit her in a way she hadn't expected. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't delivered cruelly, and she was starting to understand that cruelty required a kind of emotional investment this man held at a considerable distance, but because it was simply, baldly true. He had waited until she was standing in the rain with a broken suitcase and nowhere to go, and he had calculated that this was the correct moment, and he was right, and he was telling her that directly, and she had no idea what to do with a person who operated that way. You're a very strange man, she said. I've been told. That wasn't a compliment. I didn't take it as one. She stood up. She walked to the window and stood there with her arms crossed and looked at the city below. The scale of it, the indifferent enormity, The 10 million people moving through their lives inside of it, and none of them knowing or caring about a black woman from Baltimore standing on the 31st floor, deciding whether to marry a Korean Mafia boss for revenge. She heard him stand. He didn't approach her. He stayed by the table. "I want to be clear about something," she said, still looking out the window. "I'm not doing this because I'm desperate. I am in a difficult position right now, yes, but I'm not desperate. I know the difference." "I know you do," he said, "and if at any point I decide this arrangement is no longer in my interest, I will walk away from it, and there will be nothing you can do to prevent that." "Understood. And I want the full information on that third man in the photograph, not tonight, but soon, before we go any further." A pause. "Agreed." She turned around. He was standing exactly where he'd been, and she studied him for a moment with the clear eyes of someone who had spent 7 years reading rooms and people and the particular language of what was not being said. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated. "Don't mistake that for trust," she said. "It's strategy." For the first time, something crossed his face that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. "I know the difference," he said, and the words were an echo of hers, and she heard that and chose not to respond to it. She picked up her bag. "I'll need somewhere to stay that isn't a $60 hotel room." "That's already arranged." "Of course it is," she said, and walked to the elevator. The next 3 weeks moved at a pace she hadn't expected. She thought there would be a period of planning, of slow construction, of meetings in quiet rooms where things were carefully assembled. Instead, Min-jae operated the way a river operates, not in straight lines, but with continuous pressure, finding the available path and moving through it before anything could form to stop it. Within 48 hours of their agreement, she was installed in an apartment on the 14th floor of a building in Itaewon that was registered in a corporate name she didn't recognize, furnished in the spare and deliberate style of someone who had thought carefully about what a space needed and included exactly that and nothing more. Within 72 hours, she had a new Korean phone, a new bank card, and a meeting with 2 of Min-jae's people, a woman named Ji-hyun, who handled communications, and a man called Park, who didn't offer a first name and whose precise function Zara couldn't immediately determine, though she suspected it was the kind of function that was better not to name directly. Ji-hyun was sharp and efficient and treated Zara with a formality that was professional rather than cold, which Zara appreciated. She had spent enough time in environments where formality was a weapon. This felt different. This felt like competence. "The announcement will be quiet at first," Ji-hyun explained at their first real working meeting, spreading a calendar across the table between them. "A photograph, a confirmed sighting. We let the social pages speculate for 10 days before we confirm anything publicly. This gives the Kwon family time to hear about it before it becomes official, which is important. We want their reaction to come before they've had time to compose it." "You want to catch them off guard," Zara said. "We want them to feel the ground move before they understand why," Ji-hyun said. Zara nodded slowly. "Who takes the photograph?" "We have a contact at one of the entertainment news outlets. The image will be candid. You and Director Kang leaving a restaurant. Recognizable to anyone who knows either of you. Ambiguous enough that it can't be immediately dismissed as staged." Zara thought about the word candid. She thought about the careful architecture of something presented as accidental. She thought about how much of the world she'd been living in for the past 7 years had operated on exactly this principle, and felt the dark familiar humor of now being on the other side of it. "Fine," she said. What she hadn't expected was how it would feel to stand beside Min-jae in public. The restaurant they used for the photograph was in Cheongdam-dong, the kind of place where the menu had no prices and the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look like a better version of themselves. She wore a dress she'd chosen herself, deep burgundy, the kind of color she'd stopped wearing in the Kwon house because Ethan's mother had once mentioned with a smile that it was perhaps a bold choice. She wore it now and did not think about that. Min-jae was already there when she arrived. He stood when she approached the table, not performatively, but as a reflex, the automatic courtesy of someone whose manners were too deeply ingrained to be a show, and looked at her for a moment before she sat down. "The dress," he said. "What about it?" "Nothing," he said. "It's good." which was not exactly a compliment, she thought, but was delivered with enough directness that it landed like one. The photographer got the shot as they left. She'd been told to expect it, and had still flinched slightly when the flash went off. Old reflex. Min-jae's hand had come to the small of her back, brief and light, purely navigational, but she'd felt it through the fabric and had made herself walk normally and not respond to it in any direction. In the car afterward, he'd looked out the window and said nothing for 3 full minutes. "That was well done," he said finally. "You sound surprised." "I don't surprise easily," he said, which she already knew. "I'm noting it as a fact." "I've been performing composure in public for 7 years," she said. "I have a skill set." He looked at her then. "That's not what I meant." She didn't ask what he meant. She looked out her own window and watched Seoul pass. The news item went up at 7 the next morning. By 9, her phone, the new one, had 17 messages from numbers she didn't recognize, which Ji-hyun had warned her about and which she deleted without reading. By 11, she had 1 message from a number she did recognize. "Ethan." "What are you doing?" 3 words. No punctuation on the question mark, which she noticed because Ethan was particular about punctuation. He was rattled enough that he'd forgotten it. She put the phone face down and went back to the briefing materials Ji-hyun had prepared, a comprehensive document on the Kwon Group's corporate structure, their key partnerships, the individuals whose loyalty to the family was economic rather than personal, and who would therefore be the first to recalibrate if the wind changed. She didn't respond to Ethan. The relationship between her and Min-jae in those first weeks was a strange thing. Not cold exactly, but precise. Like 2 people who had agreed to share a space and were learning the geometry of it, where each person's edges were, which areas required negotiation, and which had natural boundaries. He was not warm, but he was not unkind. He operated on a principle of directness that she was beginning to respect in the way you respect an uncomfortable truth. Not always pleasant, but clarifying. He didn't ask about her feelings regarding Ethan. She didn't ask about whatever it was he carried behind those eyes that occasionally, in unguarded moments, looked like the residue of something very old and very costly. They were 2 people with wounds they weren't yet prepared to show each other, circling the work instead. She learned his routines without trying to. He was awake before she was. She knew this because on the 3 occasions they'd met early in the morning at the building where his offices were, he had already been in motion for hours, the particular focused stillness of someone who had completed the difficult work before others arrived. He drank tea, not coffee. He read physical documents rather than screens when he could help it. He was slower to anger than she'd expected given his reputation, but when something actually moved him, she'd witnessed this once, in a meeting with Park and 2 other men whose names she still didn't know, when a piece of information came in that clearly represented something going wrong. The temperature in the room dropped in a way that was entirely physical, and nobody spoke until he did. She was beginning to understand that his reputation for coldness was real, but not complete. He was not cold. He was contained. Those were different things. The complication arrived on a Tuesday. She was in Ji-hyun's office working through the timeline for the next phase of their public visibility, when Ji-hyun's assistant knocked and said there was someone in the lobby asking for Zara by name. Not for Min-jae. For Zara. She went down. Mrs. Kwon Soo-yeon was standing in the lobby in a cream coat, her hands folded in front of her, her posture the particular upright perfection that Zara had spent years unconsciously mimicking. She looked, at 63, exactly as she had always looked, composed, expensive, and faintly dissatisfied with everything in her immediate environment. When she saw Zara, something crossed her face that took Zara a moment to identify. Then she had it. Fear. Very small, very controlled, but there. Fear. "Zara," she said. Her Korean was, as always, immaculate. "We should talk." Zara looked at her for a moment. The lobby was not empty. 2 of Min-jae's people were visible near the entrance, professional and unhurried, and Zara understood without being told that they had already communicated upward, that someone was already aware this conversation was happening. "All right," Zara said in Korean, in perfect 7 years of work Korean that she watched land on the older woman's face with a small, satisfying impact. Let's talk. They sat in the building's ground floor meeting room. Mrs. Kwan ordered nothing. Zara ordered water she didn't drink. This thing you're doing, Mrs. Kwan said, her voice precisely modulated, is a mistake. I've made mistakes, Zara said. I'm familiar with the experience. Kang Min-jae is a dangerous man. Yes, Zara said. I know what he is. You don't know everything about what he is, Mrs. Kwan said, and something in her delivery shifted. Not to warmth, this woman didn't do warmth, but to something that was almost urgency, which on Kwan Su-yeon was its own kind of alarm. There are things about why he wants to destroy our family that you don't understand yet, things he hasn't told you. Zara held the woman's gaze. Tell me. Kang Min-jae's father was a business partner of my husband's, 30 years ago. A pause, carefully placed. There was a dispute, a significant one. My husband made a decision that ended that partnership in a way that was... She stopped. Consequential. Consequential, Zara repeated. Min-jae's father lost everything. The family fell apart. Min-jae was 17 years old. Mrs. Kwan's hands were still folded. They hadn't moved. What he's built since then, everything he is now, it was built with one purpose. This isn't about justice, Zara. This is about a man who has been planning revenge for 20 years, and you are the most recent instrument he has found to carry it out. Zara sat with that. She sat with the weight of it and the way it fit, too well in places, with things she'd already noticed, already felt around the edges of. The timing, the precision, the way Min-jae had said I needed you in a position where you had reason to act without any appearance of discomfort. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you have always been too intelligent for what happened to you in our family, Mrs. Kwan said. And it was the most honest thing the woman had ever said to her, and it arrived wrapped in the cruelest irony Zara had ever experienced. And because I would rather you make a decision based on full information than be used by another powerful man and have to survive that a second time. The room was very quiet. Zara looked at her former mother-in-law, at the cream coat and the folded hands and the fear she was still working to control, and felt something move through her that was neither sympathy nor contempt, but something more complicated and more tiring than either. Get out, she said. Mrs. Kwan blinked. I'm not finished, she said. Yes, you are, Zara said. You spent 7 years making me feel like I was lucky to be in your family. You passed divorce papers across a table and watched me leave in the rain. And now you want to sit in front of me and offer me the gift of your honesty. She stood up. I don't need your honesty, and I am very, very done being a place where Kwan family problems come to be managed. She picked up her bag. Don't come here again. She walked out of the room. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the elevator. Not from fear, from the effort of holding all of it, the truth in what Mrs. Kwan had said, and the fury at who was saying it, and the vertigo of not being sure, suddenly and completely, which parts of the ground beneath her were solid. She went to Min-jae's office. He was on a call. She walked in anyway. He looked up at her face and ended the call without explanation to whoever was on the other end. Your lobby cameras already showed you who was downstairs, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. Then you know what she was here for. I can make an educated inference. She told me about your father, Zara said. About what the Kwan family did to him. About why you've been planning this for 20 years. She watched his face. Nothing moved in it. I need you to tell me right now whether any part of what brought you to me was manufactured. Not inferred, not estimated, whether you had any active role in the circumstances that led to me being on that street. The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. No, he said. That's not enough, she said. I need more than one word. He stood up. He came around the desk and stopped 6 feet from her and looked at her with the same directness he always used, only now there was something else in it, something that sat behind the precision like a coal behind glass. The Kwan family's decision to end your marriage was their own, he said. I documented what was happening to you. I built a timeline. I waited. I did not cause any part of what they did to you. A pause. But I will not tell you I'm sorry that they did it, because I need you here. And telling you I'm sorry for something that serves my purpose would be the most dishonest thing I've ever said." Zara stared at him. The coal behind the glass was clearer now. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't guilt. It was something harder and less comfortable than either of those things. It was the particular expression of a person who has been honest when dishonesty would have been easier, and who knows the difference between those two things and has chosen accordingly, and who is waiting to see what that costs him. She turned away from him. She walked to the window. The river again. Always the river. She stood there for a long moment, and then she said, "The file she implied exists, about your father. I want to see it." Behind her, he said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "That file doesn't only contain information about my father." She turned around. His face was unreadable again, locked back into the contained precision she'd come to know. But his hands, she noticed his hands for the first time properly, really looked at them, were very still at his sides in a way that was not relaxed but controlled, the stillness of something held rather than the stillness of something at rest. "What else is in it?" she said. And he looked at her with an expression she had no prior category for. Not from Ethan, not from anyone in the Kwan household, not from any man in any room she'd ever been in, and said, "You." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Zara felt the ripples of it move outward through everything she thought she understood about why she was standing in this room, and the ground she thought she was building shifted under her in a way that told her, with absolute clarity, that whatever she'd believed this arrangement was, she had only been seeing the first page of it. She didn't move for a long time after he said it. The word hung in the air between them the way certain words do, not fading, not dissolving into the ambient noise of the city outside, but staying, acquiring weight with each second that passed. "You." 1 syllable. The most destabilizing thing anyone had said to her in a year full of destabilizing things, and it came from the one person she'd been cautiously, carefully, beginning to believe operated without concealment. "Explain that," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the thing she noticed first about herself. She'd expected volume, expected the hot rush of it, but what came out was very controlled and very quiet, the voice of someone who understood that the next several minutes required precision. Min-jae didn't look away. That, at least, he gave her. "Sit down," he said. "I don't want to sit down." Zara. Just her name. No instruction in it this time, no management, something else. She sat. Not because he'd said to, but because her legs made the decision before she did, the body registering something the mind was still processing. He went to the cabinet on the east wall. She'd noticed it before. Dark wood, locked. The only thing in the office that was locked, and used a key from his inside jacket pocket. He removed a file. Not thin, an inch thick at least, bound with a black clip, and he brought it to the desk and set it in front of her without opening it. "Open it," he said. She looked at him once more. His face was the face she'd come to know over these weeks. Contained, direct. But there was something underneath it now that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't correctly named before. It was the look of a person preparing to be judged, and who has decided, after a long internal argument, that the judgment is earned. She opened the file. The first page was a photograph. Black and white, printed on standard paper, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens. It showed a woman walking down a hospital corridor. Young, mid-20s, a bag over one shoulder, and exhaustion in the line of her back that was visible even from this distance. It took Zara 4 full seconds to understand that the woman was her. She turned the page. Another photograph. Zara outside the Kwan compound, taken from across the street, the iron gate visible in the background, dated 3 years ago. She turned the page. A document. Medical records. Not complete, redacted in places, but enough. A clinic in Apgujeong. Dates spanning 2 years. Treatment codes she recognized because she'd spent 2 years learning to read them. Had memorized them the way you memorize the vocabulary of a language you never wanted to have to speak. Fertility treatment records. Her fertility treatment records. She closed the file. She put both hands flat on it and breathed. The breath came in uneven, which she registered as information about her own state rather than something to suppress. You had my medical records, she said. Yes. How? I have people with access to. How long have you had them? A pause. 2.5 years. She picked up the file and set it on the floor because she needed the desk surface clear between them, needed the physical space to be empty. You watched me go through fertility treatment, she said. You watched me fail at it. You documented it. I documented the Kwan family's response to it, he said. What they said at their dinners. The conversations Mrs. Kwan had with Ethan about the situation. I documented how they treated you while you were going through it. That's not a different thing, she said. That's the same thing. You watched, you collected it, you filed it away and waited. Yes, he said. The fury she'd been holding since he'd said you was changing shape now. When he'd first said it, she'd felt the particular anger of someone who has been observed without consent, the violation of it, the creeping retrospective exposure of moments she'd believed were private, that was still there. But underneath it, something else was beginning to grow that was less clean and more frightening. A question she hadn't formed completely yet, but whose shape she could feel, the way you feel the shape of something in the dark before you can name it. Why? She said. Not why you documented the Kwan family. Why me specifically? Why were you watching me? Silence. Not the silence of evasion, the silence of a man deciding something. She watched him decide it, watched the almost imperceptible movement of something in his jaw, the way his eyes held hers through it, and then the moment he landed. My father, he said, was Kong Hyun Woo. He was a structural engineer. He partnered with the Kwan Group in 1994 on a series of commercial development contracts. When the partnership dissolved, when the Kwan family engineered its dissolution to absorb my father's work without compensating him, he didn't just lose the business. He stopped. He lost everything. The debt they left him with destroyed his health. He died when I was 19. Another stop, shorter this time. But before he died, he told me something. He told me the Kwan family had made the same move on another partnership years before his. A man named Whitfield, an American architect who had been contracted on a development project in Seoul in the late 80s. They took his designs and cut him out of the project, and he went home with nothing. The room tilted. Zara's hands were still on the desk. She hadn't moved them. She was aware of that, aware of every point of contact between her body and the chair, the desk, the air, in the way you become aware of your body when the ground shifts. Whitfield, she said. David Whitfield, Min-jae said. Your father. She didn't say anything. She couldn't locate language right now. It was there somewhere. She could feel the edges of it, but the pathway to it had been severed by the word David spoken in Min-jae's precise English in this room, attached to her name. Her father had been an architect. She'd known that. She'd grown up with that. The drafting table in the corner of the Baltimore house, the rolled blueprints, the particular smell of trace paper. He'd come back from a year in Seoul when she was 3 years old, and he had never talked about it. And she had absorbed the silence of it the way children absorb the things adults don't explain, filing it away as simply the year before I was old enough to remember. He had died when she was 21. Prostate cancer, slow and then fast. She had not known, had never been given the information with which to know. He never told you, Min-jae said. No, she said. The word came out scraped. I found out through my father's records. When I started building the case against the Kwan family, I traced every person they'd done this to. Your father was the earliest documented case. He paused. When I found you, when I discovered that David Whitfield's daughter had married Ethan Kwan, I thought at first it was a coincidence. Was it? A beat. No. She felt ice move through her. Explain that. The Kwan family knew who you were when Ethan brought you home, Min-jae said. They ran background checks on all serious relationships their sons pursued, standard practice for families at that level. His voice was still even, still controlled, but she could hear something in it now. The effort, the evenness cost. They knew your surname. They knew your father's history with the company. Mrs. Kwan made the decision to allow the marriage. Why? Because having David Whitfield's daughter inside the family, bound to them by marriage and legally unable to act against them, was a form of insurance. And because, he stopped for just a moment, there are people who enjoy that kind of thing, that kind of irony. The room was very quiet. Zara thought about 7 years. She thought about every Sunday dinner, every event, every careful studied moment of making herself acceptable to these people. She thought about Ethan's hand in hers in the airport at her mother's funeral. She thought about fertility treatments and medical appointments, and 2 years of hope and loss. And hope again, and the particular face Mrs. Kwan made when she smiled across the table. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to Min Jae and looked at the city and breathed. In, out, in. The fury was past its limit now, past the place where it could be held in any vessel. And what was happening in her chest was not fury anymore, but something older and larger and more fundamental. The kind of pain that doesn't announce itself with tears, but with a terrible stillness. "You knew all of this," she said to the window, "when you sat down across from me in that coffee house." "Yes. You knew my father's name. You knew why they'd let me marry him. You knew the entire history." "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." The silence was different this time. She turned around to look at him, and his face was the first unguarded thing she'd seen on him in all the weeks she'd known him. Not collapsed, not broken, but open in a way that clearly cost him something. The face of a man who has removed a layer of armor because the situation has made armor dishonest. "No," he said, "I didn't tell you." "Why?" "Because I didn't know how the information would land," he said. "Whether it would make you more motivated or whether it would destroy your ability to function in the arrangement. I made a calculation." "You made a calculation," she said. "About my father, about my history, about what I could handle." She heard her own voice go flat in a way that was worse than volume. "You sat across from me and you told me you found dishonesty inefficient, and you made a calculation about which pieces of my own life to give me." He didn't defend it. That was the thing. He didn't reach for a justification or a qualifier. He held her eyes and let the words be what they were. "Yes," he said. She picked up her bag. Her hands were shaking again. She could feel it, couldn't stop it, and she didn't try to. "I'm leaving," she said. "Zara, don't." She stopped at the door and turned back once. "Don't call me tonight. Don't send Ji-hyun. Don't manage this." She looked at him across the length of the office. The man she'd been building something with, or thought she had been, or maybe had been. She no longer trusted her own ability to read the situation. "I need to think without anyone's calculation involved." She left. The elevator down was the longest 31 floors of her life. She walked for 2 hours. No destination, no direction, just the city under her feet and the cold of the evening coming in off the river and her own breath visible in the air ahead of her. The body's proof of being alive. Seoul moved around her and she moved through it, and she thought about her father's drafting table and the blueprints rolled in the corner and the year he'd spent in the city that he never talked about, that she'd been too young to ask about, and then too busy, and then he was gone and the questions had gone with him. She thought about Mrs. Kwan's face across 7 years of Sunday dinners, the particular quality of the woman's composure, the smile, the questions about children delivered with surgical precision into the soft places. She thought about whether Mrs. Kwan had looked at her across those dinners and seen David Whitfield's daughter and felt something private and satisfying about it, and the thought made her stop walking for a moment on a bridge over a small canal, gripping the railing with both hands, the metal cold through her gloves. She thought about Min Jae. She thought about the file, the photographs. Her walking down a hospital corridor 2.5 years ago, carrying the exhaustion of that time in the line of her back, unknowing that she was being observed, that her private suffering was being documented by a man she hadn't met yet. The violation of that was real. She wasn't going to negotiate herself out of it or find a framing that made it more acceptable. It was a violation and she was going to let it be that. And at the same time, and this was the part she couldn't resolve, couldn't flatten into something manageable. At the same time, she thought about what he had built. The file. The years of documentation. The careful accumulated evidence of what the Kwan family had done, not only to his father, not only to hers, but to the people they'd discarded and consumed along the way. She thought about a 19-year-old boy watching his father die under the weight of a debt, manufactured by men who never thought about consequences because they'd never been required to. She thought about what a person built out of that, what shape the grief took when you had nowhere to put it for 20 years. She didn't forgive it. She wasn't in the business of forgiving things tonight. But she understood it with a clarity that made her angry because she didn't want to understand it right now. She wanted the luxury of simple betrayal. Her phone rang at 9:47. Not Min-jae, not Ji-hyun. A number she didn't have saved, but the area code was one she recognized from her weeks of learning the topography of Seoul's districts, and something made her pick up. Ms. Whitfield, a man's voice, Korean accent, English careful and deliberate. My name is not important right now. What is important is that I have information you need, and I need to give it to you before tomorrow morning. She gripped the phone. Who are you? Someone who works for people who have been watching the same situation you're inside of, from a different angle. A pause. The Kwon family is not waiting for you and Kang Min-jae to act against them. They began their countermove 4 days ago. Her stomach dropped. What countermove? Financial fraud documentation, the man said, fabricated. It's being prepared for submission to the Financial Crimes Investigation Unit. Your name is on it, Ms. Whitfield. The narrative is that you used your position as Min-jae's public partner to facilitate the movement of money through accounts connected to the Kwon Group's competitors, making it appear you were engaged in corporate espionage and financial manipulation for personal gain. A pause. It is detailed enough to be credible, and it will be submitted tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. unless something stops it. She closed her eyes. How do you know this? Because I prepared part of it, the man said, before I decided I was done doing that kind of work. She opened her eyes. The canal below the bridge moved, black and quiet. What do you want from me? Nothing tonight. I'm giving you this because I was present when your father's name was first put in a Kwon family file in 1988, and I have spent 30 years making compromises I won't make anymore. His voice was steady, but thin. The voice of someone with something physically wrong with them, age or illness or both. Go to Kang Min-jae tonight. Tell him what I've told you. The fraud filing can be stopped, but only if he moves before 8 a.m., and there is only one way to move fast enough. What way? He'll know, the man said, and hung up. She stood on the bridge for 30 seconds. Then she started walking back. Min-jae answered the door of his apartment. She'd been given the address by Ji-hyun in the first week in case of emergency and had never used it until now, before she knocked, which meant the building security had told him she was coming, which, under other circumstances, she would have had thoughts about. She told him, all of it, quickly and completely, the way you deliver information when the clock is already running. She watched his face as she talked, the contained precision of it, the absence of surprise, and then the single moment when something shifted, when the information about the morning filing reached him and the quality of his stillness changed from controlled to alert, the stillness of an animal that has identified a threat. When she finished, he was already moving. He had his phone in his hand, was already dialing, was already walking toward the room she understood was his operational center, the room she'd never been invited into. He stopped at the door of it. He turned back. I should have told you about your father from the beginning, he said. No qualifier, no contextualizing framework, no architecture of explanation around it. Just the sentence. She looked at him. Yes, she said. You should have. I'm sorry, he said. The words were plainly meant. She could see that. She could see that he had not said them lightly, and that they cost him something, and that the cost was genuine. She also knew that genuine cost and forgiveness were not the same transaction, and that right now there were larger things requiring her attention than the internal accounting of whether she was ready to receive an apology. Stop the filing, she said. We'll have the rest of this conversation when there's time to have it properly. He held her eyes for one more second. Then he nodded and opened the door to the operational room, and she caught a glimpse before it closed. Screens, multiple, and 3 people she'd never seen before moving with the focused urgency of people who already knew something was wrong. And then the door shut and she was alone in his hallway. She sat down on the floor with her back against the wall. She thought about her father. about the blueprints in the corner of the Baltimore house, about the year and soul he never spoke of, about whether he'd known somewhere in him that his daughter was going to end up in this city, inside this story, and whether that was something he'd carried. She thought about the fraud documents being prepared right now with her name on them. She thought about the particular species of fury that had been growing in her since she'd opened that file. Not the hot fury she'd felt outside the Quan gate, not the cold fury she'd felt looking at her own reflection in the subway window, but something different from both of those. Something harder. Something that had been building for 7 years and maybe longer, maybe since she was a girl watching her father come home from a year abroad with something missing from him that he never recovered, and she'd been too young to name what it was. She understood it now. She understood what they'd taken. From him. From her. The long arithmetic of what the Quan family had extracted from the people who trusted them, the people who worked for them, the people they married their sons to as a form of filing system. She was done being part of anyone's filing system. The door to the operational room opened 2 hours later, and Min Jae came out. His jacket was off. She'd never seen him without the jacket. He looked at her on the floor and said nothing about it, just stood with his back against the opposite wall and slid down it until he was sitting across from her, which was such an unexpected thing for him to do that for a moment she just looked at him. "The filing has been delayed," he said. "Not stopped. Delayed. We have a window of approximately 72 hours before they find another route to submit it." 72 hours, she said. "To do what we've been building toward," he said. "All of it, compressed into 3 days instead of 3 months. Can it be done?" "It can be done," he said, "but not the way I planned it." He looked at her directly. "The way I planned it, you were a supporting element. The way this has to work now, you're the center of it." "Tell me," she said. "The Quan family's board meets in 4 days for their quarterly review. If we can get you into that room, not as Ethan's ex-wife, not as my partner, but as a shareholder." He stopped. "Your father's original contract with the Quan Group in 1988 included an equity clause, a small one, but legally binding. It was never honored. I have the documentation." He paused. "It means you have a legal claim to a seat in that room. Not a large one, but enough." She stared at him. "My father had a contract with them." "Your father had a contract with them." The long quiet that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of 30 years and a drafting table in a Baltimore house and a year nobody talked about and a man who came home with something missing. "You were going to tell me this," she said slowly. "Eventually. When it was useful." He held her eyes. He didn't deny it. "Yes." She breathed in, out. The hallway was still. Somewhere in the operational room, people were moving, screens were running, the mechanism of what came next was already turning. "Here's what's going to happen," Zara said. Her voice, she noticed, had gone to a place she hadn't heard it before. Not the controlled quiet of someone managing grief, not the cold, flat tone of someone managing fury, but something more fundamental than either of those. The voice of someone who has passed through the available emotional registers and come out the other side into clarity. "You are going to give me full access to every piece of documentation in that file. Everything, including the parts about my father, including whatever else you've been holding back. You are not going to decide what I can handle. That is finished." She watched his face. He didn't move. "And then we are going to walk into that boardroom in 4 days. And I am going to be there not as your instrument or your entry point or your anything. I'm going to be there as David Whitfield's daughter with a legal claim that has been owed for 30 years, and I am going to collect what my family is owed and dismantle what needs to be dismantled, and I am going to do it myself." She paused. "You can stand beside me if you want, but I am not a supporting element. I am the center of this. I always was." Min Jae looked at her for a long time. Then something in him settled. Not defeated, not diminished, but settled in the way a structure settles when the last piece is correctly placed, finding its true position after a long time of being slightly wrong. "I know," he said. Outside, Seoul moved through another night, indifferent as ever, and the clock on the building across the street read 11:58, and somewhere across the city, a man Zara didn't know was deciding whether his 30-year-old compromise was truly finished, and in the Quan compound, the lights in the upper windows burned amber and certain, And the people inside them had no idea that the woman they'd put out in the rain was no longer trying to survive what they'd done to her. She was preparing to make them answer for it, for all of it, going back further than they knew. They worked through the night. Not metaphorically, literally through it, the hours burning down from midnight to 1 to 3 to 5, the operational room filling with the particular smell of cold coffee and concentrated effort, screens running data that Zara was now reading in real time, because Min-jae had done what she'd asked and opened everything, every file, every layer of documentation, and she had sat down in front of it and absorbed it with the focused hunger of someone who had been starved of the truth for a very long time. Ji-hyun arrived at 1:30 without being called. Park came at 2. Two other people Zara had seen in passing but never been introduced to materialized by 2:30, and nobody explained them, and she didn't ask, because the room had acquired a momentum that explanation would only interrupt. Min-jae moved between screens and people with the economical precision of someone running a mechanism he'd been building for years, issuing instructions in short bursts. Korean, English, occasionally something in between when speed mattered more than language. And Zara watched him work and understood, for the first time fully, what he actually was. Not a criminal in the way the word usually sat in a room. Not a man who had built his empire on simple brutality. What he'd built was closer to infrastructure, a parallel system of information and leverage that operated in the spaces the official world preferred not to examine. It was not clean. She wasn't telling herself it was clean, but it was purposeful in a way that had a through line she could now trace back to a 19-year-old boy in a hospital room watching his father diminish. And the through line was cold and hard and made a terrible kind of sense. She didn't have the luxury of moral accounting right now. That was a conversation for after. At 3 a.m., she found the clause. It was buried in the third subfolder of a scanned document set. Her father's original 1988 contract with the Kwon Group's predecessor company, pages of dense legal Korean that Min-jae's team had partially translated, and there on page 11, subsection 4.3, was the equity participation clause. Small. 4% of the project's net profits, convertible to a nominal equity stake in the parent company upon project completion. The project had completed. The profits had been substantial. The stake had never been issued. The original contract bore her father's signature, David Whitfield. His handwriting, which she recognized, the particular backward lean of it, the way he made his capital D. And she put her finger on it for just a moment before she moved on, because she couldn't afford to stop there, couldn't afford to let that particular door open right now. The equity clause, she said across the room to Min-jae. Has anyone challenged it legally, ever? He looked up from the screen he was at. No, the Kwon family counted on your father not knowing Korean law well enough to pursue it, and then on time making it irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, she said. No, he said, it is not. She turned back to the documents. Get me a corporate lawyer, someone not connected to any of your usual structures, someone clean, before 6 a.m. He picked up his phone. She kept reading. The 72-hour window compressed, as 72 hours will when the pressure on them is sufficient, into something that felt more like 20. The fraud filing delay they'd bought was holding, but the mechanism of it was fragile. A contact within the Financial Crimes Unit who had agreed to sit on the submission pending a procedural review that wouldn't survive scrutiny for long. They had until the board meeting. 4 days on the clock when she'd spoken to Min-jae in the hallway. Now, with the night burned through and the city beginning to gray outside the windows, they had 3. The lawyer arrived at 5:45. Her name was Cho Yoon-ji, and she was 41, and she came in wearing yesterday's clothes under a fresh jacket, which told Zara she'd been reached while already working something else, and had come directly. She had the face of someone who treated sleep as a negotiable resource, and had been winning that negotiation for years. Zara put the contract in front of her and gave her 20 minutes and a cup of coffee. At the end of 20 minutes, Cho Yoon-ji looked up. This is enforceable, she said. Not easily. The statute of limitations arguments alone will take... I don't need it enforced in court, Zara said. I need it recognized by the board. Enough to get me a seat in the room. Enough that if they refuse, the refusal is on record. Cho Yoon-ji looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at Min-jae, who was standing by the wall with his arms crossed, and then back at Zara, with the expression of someone recalibrating which person in the room was running the operation. "That," she said slowly, "is achievable. If you file a formal shareholder recognition claim today and they fail to respond within 48 hours, you can appear at the board meeting as a creditor with disputed equity standing. They can't legally remove you from the building without triggering a whole separate set of problems." "Do it," Zara said. The filing went in at 8:17 a.m. By 9:40, Ethan called. She was in the car with Ji-hyun, moving across the city toward the first of 3 meetings they'd scheduled for the day. Associates of the Kwon Group's key business partners, people whose loyalty to the family was, as Ji-hyun had assessed, economic rather than personal. She looked at Ethan's name on the screen for 2 rings. Then she picked up. "What?" she said. "What are you doing?" His voice was different from the last time. Not the carefully modulated late-night call, not the controlled register of a man managing guilt. This was raw. She could hear something in it she hadn't heard in a long time, hadn't heard since the early years when he'd been more fully himself and less fully his family's project. He was frightened. "Zara, what are you doing? You filed a shareholder claim." "My father had a valid contract," she said. "The equity was never issued. I'm correcting that." "You can't just—" "Ethan," she kept her voice level. Outside the window, Seoul moved past, morning crisp and indifferent. "Your family took something from my father 30 years ago, and then they brought me into your house knowing exactly who I was, and they spent 7 years using that knowledge to keep something over me that I didn't even know was there." She paused. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm telling you, as a courtesy, that what's coming is coming, and you should decide whose side of it you want to be on." A silence. She heard him breathe. The old sound of it, the rhythm she'd known better than her own once, had slept beside for 7 years. "I didn't know," he said, "about your father. I didn't know any of that." "I believe you," she said. And she did, mostly. Ethan's sin was not cruelty but compliance. The endless, corrosive compliance of a man who'd chosen the easier thing so many times it had become the only thing he knew how to choose. But belief doesn't change what happened. She hung up. Ji-hyun, who had been looking out of her window with the professional discretion of someone who had worked for Min-jae long enough to have developed a complete immunity to dramatic phone calls, said nothing. "Next meeting," Zara said. 15 minutes, Ji-hyun said. The next 3 days were a different kind of war than the one Zara had been preparing for when she'd first sat across from Min-jae in that dark-wooded coffee house. She'd imagined something more cinematic, a single confrontation, a room, a moment. What the reality looked like was 12-hour days of meetings and documents and phone calls and the slow, grinding work of moving pieces into position, one conversation at a time. It looked like Zara sitting across from men who had done business with the Kwon family for decades, and watching them recalibrate in real time as she laid evidence in front of them. Not threatening, not performing, just placing facts on tables and letting the facts speak their own language. It looked like Min-jae moving in parallel through a different set of rooms, doing the work that required his particular kind of architecture, and Zara not asking the details of that because she understood enough about what he was to know that the details were not for her to carry, and he was not doing anything she hadn't implicitly agreed to by being in this at all. It looked like exhaustion, real exhaustion, the kind that lives in the back of the skull and makes ordinary light feel like too much. She slept in 4-hour segments and woke already moving and drank the tea Min-jae's assistant brought her because coffee had stopped working sometime around day 2. On the evening before the board meeting, Min-jae found her in the operational room at 11 p.m., still working through the final presentation they'd assembled, the evidence package, the shareholder claim, the documented history of the Kwon Group's contract violations going back 30 years, all of it organized into something a room full of board members could not look at and pretend they hadn't seen. He stood behind her for a moment, looking at the screen. She could feel him there. Had developed, over these weeks, an awareness of him in a room that she didn't examine too closely. "Go to sleep," he said. "Not yet." "You won't perform well tomorrow on—" "I know how I perform," she said. I've been performing under conditions that would break most people for 7 years. I know my limits. A pause. He pulled the chair beside her and sat in it, which surprised her. He rarely sat beside her, it was always across. The table between them, the geometry of negotiation. Beside was different. Beside meant something else. I want to tell you something, he said. Not strategic, not related to tomorrow. She turned to look at him. This close, in the low light of the operational room with the screens casting their blue-white glow across everything, she could see the lines of his face with a clarity the ordinary lighting of their meetings didn't offer. The age in him, not old, but marked. The particular marks of someone who has carried a specific weight for a specific long time. When I first put your name in a file, he said, you were a subject of investigation, a data point in a case I was building. He held her eyes. That's not what you are now. I want to be honest about the fact that I don't know exactly when that changed or what to call what it changed into. But it changed, and you should know that before you walk into that room tomorrow. She looked at him for a moment. The exhaustion was real, and the complexity of him was real, and the thing he was being honest about was real, and she held all three of those at once. Ask me again, she said, when this is over. He nodded. Once. That was enough. She turned back to the screen. He stayed beside her for another hour, working in silence, and she let him stay. The Quan Group's quarterly board meeting was held in their corporate headquarters tower, 42 floors of glass and steel in central Seoul, the kind of building that announced its own importance from 6 blocks away. Zara had been inside it twice, both times as Ethan's wife, both times in the particular invisible way she'd moved through that world. She arrived now in a car that was not invisible, with Cho Yoon-ji beside her carrying a legal document case and Min Jae on her other side, and she wore black. Not the soft, careful black of the Kwan family dinners, but something harder lined, something that didn't apologize for the space it occupied. The lobby security knew who Min Jae was. She watched that knowledge move through them when they saw him. The almost imperceptible adjustment, the recalibration of posture, the particular quality of alert that certain people produce in certain rooms. He said nothing. He simply walked, unhurried, with Zara beside him and Cho Yoon-ji at his shoulder. They were stopped on the 38th floor. 2 men, suits, the professional blankness of corporate security. One of them held up a hand. This floor is restricted to board members and their authorized representatives, he said in Korean. Cho Yoon-ji handed him the shareholder recognition filing before the sentence was fully finished. He looked at it. He looked at his partner. He made a call on his radio. 3 minutes passed in the hallway. Zara standing with her hands at her sides, her breathing controlled, her heartbeat doing what it was going to do, and she was not going to address it. And then the doors to the boardroom opened. She walked in. The Kwan Group's board was 9 people. She knew 4 of them by face from the 7 years of events and dinners. They knew her. She watched that recognition move through the room in a wave, saw the faces shift from the prepared blankness of men who had been warned something was coming to something more complex when they saw her specifically, saw what she was wearing and the documents in Cho Yoon-ji's hands and who was standing at her right shoulder. Mrs. Kwon Soo-yeon was seated at the far end of the table. She went completely still when she saw Zara. Her hands were on the table in front of her and she did not move them. Her face held, composure intact, but her eyes? Zara looked at her eyes and saw the thing she'd glimpsed in the lobby 2 weeks ago. The fear, but larger now and less controlled. The fear of a woman who has understood that what she thought was a problem she could manage has become something else entirely. Ethan was not in the room. She noted that and put it aside. The board chairman, a man named Director Song, 65, the particular silver-haired authority of someone who had occupied the same seat for 20 years, looked at Zara and then at the legal documents Cho Yoon-ji was placing on the table and said, in precise English that he deployed like a weapon, Ms. Whitfield, this is highly irregular. Yes, Zara said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. So was what your organization did to my father in 1988. We're addressing both today. A sound moved through the room that wasn't quite noise, just the collective adjustment of 9 people understanding that what they'd thought this meeting would be was not what it was going to be. Minjai took the chair beside her. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Zara put her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she'd used in his office weeks ago, the same intent behind it, presence without aggression, and looked at Director Song. "I'd like to begin," she said. What followed was not like the confrontation she'd imagined in the months of building toward this. It was not a speech. It was not a single dramatic revelation. It was instead something harder and more thorough than that. A systematic presentation of evidence, document by document, that she and Minjai's team had spent 72 hours assembling, and she walked the board through it with the methodical precision of someone who had learned over 7 years of being the outsider who had to be twice as prepared as everyone else, that facts were the only currency she could absolutely trust. The infrastructure fraud, the falsified contracts, the subsidiary shell structure, the 2 projects currently under delayed structural review, and then, last, the original 1988 contract with her father's signature and the equity clause that had never been honored. She laid them all on the table, one by one. Mrs. Kwan spoke for the first time when Zara placed the 1988 contract in the center of the table. "This document is 30 years old," she said. Her voice was controlled but thin at the edges. "Whatever its contents was valid then," Cho Yun-ji said, "is valid now under corporate succession law, which the Kwan Group has been subject to through 3 formal restructurings that each explicitly maintained the assumption of prior liabilities." She set the succession documentation beside the contract. "This has been reviewed by 3 independent legal opinions in the past 48 hours. "You had 48 hours, Director Song said, looking at Zara. "I had 30 years, Zara said. "I just didn't know it yet." The room went quiet. Minjai shifted slightly in the chair beside her. He still hadn't spoken. She understood now, in a way she hadn't fully understood before, what his silence in a room cost other people. How the contained quality of his attention, directed at the people across the table, operated as its own form of pressure. The board members who looked at him and then looked away quickly were doing the math of what he was and what he was doing here and what his presence in this room alongside this woman and these documents meant for them personally. Director Song said, "What exactly are you asking for, Ms. Whitfield?" She'd thought about this. She'd thought about it for 3 days, and she'd made her decision before she walked into this room, and she gave it now without performance. "The equity claim from my father's contract honored at current valuation. Full public disclosure of the infrastructure fraud documentation to the appropriate regulatory bodies. I'm not filing it. You are. That's the difference between this happening cleanly and happening in a way that involves criminal prosecution of everyone in this room who was present during any of the 3 projects." She paused. "And a formal shareholder resolution acknowledging the Kwan Group's historical practice of contract suppression entered into the company record." "That would destroy the company's reputation," one of the other board members said. "Your company's choices destroyed its reputation," Zara said. "I'm offering you the opportunity to control how that becomes known." Another silence. This one longer. It was Mrs. Kwan who broke it. She looked at Zara from the far end of the table with the full composed dignity of someone who had spent 63 years practicing the art of control, and she said, "You have become quite formidable, Zara." Zara looked at her. "I was always formidable," she said. "You just didn't think it was worth noticing." The doors at the far end of the boardroom opened, not the doors she'd come through, the secondary doors, the ones that led from the internal corridor, and through them came Ethan. He looked worse than she'd expected. Not physically damaged, but worn in a way that age alone couldn't account for. The wearing of someone who had been at war with themselves and losing. He stopped just inside the doorway and looked at the room, and then specifically at Zara, and in his face she saw something that she hadn't allowed herself to look for in a long time, because looking for it had cost her too much. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like he was seeing her the way someone sees something when the frame around it has been removed and the thing itself is finally just what it is. He crossed the room. He didn't look at his mother. He stopped beside the table and looked at Director Song and said, in Korean, "I'm voting with the shareholder." The room cracked open. Mrs. Kwan said her son's name once, sharply. He didn't look at her. He pulled out the empty chair on Zara's other side and sat down, and she felt his presence there and did not move and did not speak, and did not in any way indicate what it cost her to hold that stillness, because she was not done yet and she needed every resource she had for what was still happening. Director Song looked at Ethan, at Min Jae, at Zara, at the documents on the table between them. He was a man who had been in rooms where power shifted before. She could see that, could see the thing in him that was calculating not how to stop this, but how to position himself in relation to what it was becoming. He picked up the 1988 contract and looked at it for a long moment. "We'll need to recess," he said. 40 minutes, Cho Eun-ji said. "Then we reconvene and you give us a formal response to each point. In writing." He looked at her. He nodded. The board filed out of the room, all except Mrs. Kwan, who remained seated at the far end of the table as if leaving were a concession she refused to make. Zara looked at her across the length of it, across all the empty chairs, and Mrs. Kwan looked back, and neither of them said anything. And the silence between them was not comfortable and was not meant to be, and contained everything that had ever happened between them distilled to its pure, unmediated form. Then Min Jae's phone buzzed. He looked at it. Something moved in his face. That single degree of shift she'd learned to read. "What?" she said quietly. He turned the phone toward her. A message from Park. 4 words and an attachment. They moved the filing. She looked at the time on the attachment. The fraud filing, the fabricated financial crimes document with her name on it, had been submitted not through the financial crimes unit, but through a secondary channel she hadn't known existed, time-stamped 20 minutes ago, while they were sitting in this boardroom believing the delay was holding. She looked up at Min Jae. "How bad?" she said. His jaw was set in the particular way she'd only seen once before, in the operational room when the information about the morning submission had reached him. "The secondary channel goes directly to the Financial Crimes Prosecutor's office. We can't delay it from there. It's already in the system." She held his eyes. Her heart was hitting the inside of her chest with a force she could feel in her throat. "Who filed it?" she said. He looked at the phone again. Then he looked up and across the empty table to where Mrs. Kwan was still seated at the far end, still perfectly composed, her hands still folded in front of her, and she looked back at them with the expression of a woman who had just played the card she'd been holding and was waiting to see what it cost her. Zara looked at the woman, at the folded hands, at the face she'd studied across 7 years of Sunday dinners, had read and misread and read again, had spent years trying to find something human in, and occasionally had. She felt the fury move through her in one long wave, and she let it go through completely, and when it passed, what was left was not despair. It was absolute, weaponized clarity. She put her hands on the table. She looked at Min Jae. "Tell Park to freeze every liquid asset in the Kwan Group's operating accounts. All of them. Every account you have access to, right now." Min Jae looked at her for 1 second. The weight of what she was asking sat between them, the full acknowledgement of what it meant, what he would have to use, what it would cost, what doors it closed behind them permanently. "That's everything," he said, not objecting, clarifying. "I know," she said. He picked up the phone. The freeze went through at 2:17 p.m. Park executed it across 11 accounts simultaneously. The Kwan Group's primary operating accounts, 2 subsidiary holding structures, and the personal accounts of 3 board members who had been foolish enough to keep their assets inside the same corporate banking architecture as the family. It was not legal in the way that most things Min Jae did were not legal, which was to say it occupied a space between capability and permission that the law had not yet fully mapped, and it would create consequences that would take months to untangle. But it worked. Zara knew it worked because she watched Mrs. Kwan's phone light up on the table in front of her. The woman had stopped pretending not to have it when the board recessed, had been monitoring something on it with the focused attention of someone managing a parallel operation. And she watched Mrs. Kwan look at the screen and go still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. This stillness was not composure. This was the stillness of a person who has just received information that has removed the floor from under them. She looked up at Zara. Zara looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and in that moment was the entire compressed history of 7 years and 30 years, and a contract signed in 1988 by a man with a particular backward-leaning handwriting who had come home from Seoul with something missing that his daughter had been too young to ask about. "The filing," Zara said. that you just submitted with my name on it. You have approximately 1 hour before it reaches active review. I would suggest you spend that hour making calls to withdraw it." Mrs. Kwan said, "You froze our accounts." "Yes, but you understand that is leverage," Zara said. "The same kind you've been using on people for 30 years. I've learned from the best." She held the woman's gaze without blinking. "Withdraw the filing. Agree to the terms I put on the table, and we unfreeze the accounts and you keep what's left of your company, diminished as it will be." She paused. "Or don't. And we see how long your board members' loyalty holds when they can't access their own payroll accounts." The 40 minutes of recess became 90. Zara sat in the boardroom with Cho Yun-ji and Min Jae and Ethan, who had not moved from the chair he'd taken at her side and who had not spoken since his initial declaration, sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands over his mouth, looking at the grain of the wood in a way that was clearly not about the wood. Min Jae worked his phone in the contained, continuous way of someone managing multiple situations with the same two hands. Cho Yun-ji reviewed documents. Zara sat and breathed. She was exhausted in a way that went below muscle and bone. The exhaustion of the long-distance runner who has been running a race she didn't know was happening for years before someone handed her a number and pointed to the finish line. Her hands on the table were still. She focused on keeping them still, not because stillness was required, but because it was the thing she could control, and controlling small things was how she'd gotten through the uncontrollable ones. At 4:03, Director Song came back into the boardroom. He looked older than he had 90 minutes ago. Not dramatically, just the particular aging that happens to people who have spent a long time managing something and have just discovered the management is no longer sufficient. He sat down across from her and placed a single document on the table between them and said, "Mrs. Kwan has agreed to withdraw the fraud submission. It is being recalled as we speak." Cho Yun-ji's phone buzzed. She looked at it and nodded once at Zara. "And the terms," Zara said. "The board has voted to accept the equity claim valuation as submitted by your legal representative. The figure will be transferred within 10 business days." He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "The self-disclosure to the regulatory body will be filed by end of week. The company's legal team will handle the language." "My legal team reviews the language first," Cho Yun-ji said. A pause. "Agreed." "And the board resolution," Zara said. Director Song looked at her with the expression of a man swallowing something that will take a long time to go down. "The resolution will be entered into the company record at the next formal board meeting." Zara looked at him. She looked at him for long enough that he understood she was assessing whether what he'd said was the full truth or a managed version of it, and that she had developed, over the course of the past weeks, a reasonably sophisticated ability to tell the difference. "All right," she said. She stood up. Cho Yun-ji stood beside her. Min Jae rose from his chair in that unhurried way of his, and she felt him stand more than she saw it, the shift in the room's weight that happened when he moved. She looked at Director Song one more time. "My father's name," she said. "David Whitfield. I want it in the board resolution, not as a footnote, as one of the primary cases of record." Director Song looked like he wanted to object. He didn't. "It will be included," he said. She nodded. Then she turned and walked toward the boardroom doors. And she did not look at the far end of the table where Mrs. Kwan was still seated, because she had looked at that woman for the last time in the boardroom 40 minutes ago, and she had nothing left to say to her and nothing left to need from her, and she understood that the absence of that need was the most significant thing she was walking out with. She was almost at the door when she heard Ethan's chair scrape back. She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. She heard him cross the room and stop behind her, close enough that she could hear his breathing. The specific rhythm of it she'd spent years sleeping beside, had learned the way you learn something by proximity and repetition until it lives in your body even after the reason for knowing it is gone. "Zara," he said. She turned. He looked at her with the eyes she'd first seen across a university library when she'd been 22 years old, and the world had felt like a place that would accommodate her. He looked at her, and what was in his face was not the managed affect of the man who had sat at the table while his mother handled his marriage like a piece of business. What was in his face was something more expensive than that, something it had apparently taken him this long and this much to arrive at. "I'm sorry," he said. Not for the company. Not because of what you've done today, or what it costs us. He stopped, started again. I'm sorry for the Sunday dinners, for the doctor's offices, for looking at the table. His voice caught once on that last part and he controlled it, jaw tightening, and then it was controlled. I knew what she was. I knew what she was doing to you, and I told myself the stories people tell themselves when they don't want to know what they know. I'm sorry for that. Specifically. Zara looked at him for a long moment. The man she'd loved was in there somewhere. She could see him. He'd been in there the whole time. That was the particular tragedy of Ethan Kwan. That he was not a monster, but a person who had chosen badly and repeatedly in the direction of least resistance until the choices had accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like a monster's work. I know you are, she said, and she meant it. Take care of yourself, Ethan. She turned and walked through the door. The consequences arrived over the following weeks the way consequences always do. Not in a single clean wave, but in a series of smaller ones, each requiring something, each extracting its own toll. The Kwan Group's self-disclosure to the regulatory body created the kind of news cycle that the sole financial press treated like oxygen. The family's name moved through the coverage with the momentum of something that had been building for a long time and was now finding its natural channel. 3 of the 9 board members announced their resignations within the first week. 2 of the Kwan Group's major business partners issued statements reviewing their association. The structural review of the 2 infrastructure projects was accelerated by the regulatory body, and the findings, when they came, confirmed what Min Jae's documentation had already established. The Kwan family did not collapse entirely. That was the reality Zara had to sit with. That reality was not cinematic, not clean. They lost significant assets. They lost credibility in the circles where credibility was their primary currency. Mrs. Kwan issued a statement through the family's lawyers that was so thoroughly managed it contained no actual content, and Zara read it once and did not read it again. What did not happen was prison. The self-disclosure agreement came with a structured penalty that stopped short of criminal charges against the family principals. Zara had known this was likely. She had made her peace with it before she walked into that boardroom, because she had understood that the version of justice available to her was not the version from movies or from the stories people told about how power worked. The version available to her was imperfect and incomplete and real. She had learned by then to work with real. The fraud filing with her name on it was formally withdrawn, and the withdrawal confirmed in writing by the Financial Crimes Unit. Cho Yunji filed the confirmation in a folder she gave to Zara with the words, "Keep this forever," and no further elaboration. The equity transfer came through on the 9th business day. Zara looked at the figure in her account for a long time. It was not the kind of money that changed every equation. It was the kind that changed specific ones, quietly and permanently, and what it meant to her was not primarily financial. It meant her father's work had been worth something. It meant the year and soul he never talked about had not ended in pure loss. It meant something had been returned, even at this distance, even this late. She transferred a portion of it to an account she'd already established, with Cho Yoon-ji's help, for the foundation she'd been thinking about since before the board meeting. She didn't have a name for it yet. The purpose she had: resources and legal support for people navigating the particular kind of displacement she'd navigated. Immigrants, foreign spouses, people caught inside family structures that had consumed them. People who had done everything right, and had still found themselves on a cold sidewalk with a broken-wheeled suitcase and nowhere to go. She'd been one of them. She knew what that felt like from the inside. That felt like the most relevant qualification she had. Min Jae found out about the foundation the way he found out about most things, through the people whose job it was to know things, and said nothing to her about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came to the apartment in Itaewon, where she was still living, and sat across from her at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he didn't drink and said, "I want to offer the foundation operational support. Not money, legal infrastructure, security consultation." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because what you're building is more important than what I've been building," he said. He said it without the particular quality of a man making a grand statement. He said it the way he said most things, like a fact he'd assessed and was reporting accurately. "And because I have resources that are better used this way than the ways I've been using them." She studied him. You're talking about stepping back from the other operations. Some of them. The ones that can be stepped back from. A pause. Not all of it happens overnight. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm a different person. I'm the same person making different calculations. What changed the calculation? He looked at her across the table. Just looked for a moment without the professional containment she'd come to know so well, without the architecture of strategic intent that usually framed everything he did. Just a man at a kitchen table with tea going cold between his hands. You did, he said. She absorbed that. I'm not a redemption narrative for you, she said. Not unkindly. I'm not going to be the thing that justifies 20 years of... No, he said. I'm not asking you to be. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. What I'm saying is that watching you walk into that boardroom, knowing everything you knew, carrying everything you were carrying, and do what you did the way you did it. He stopped. I've been operating on the assumption that the way I was doing things was the only way to get results against people like the Kwan family. You proved that assumption wrong. That's not redemption. That's education. Zara looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the apartment window, Seoul was doing what Seoul always did, moving at its own enormous pace, unconcerned. The support for the foundation, she said. We'd need clear terms, nothing that compromises the foundation's independence. Agreed. And you don't get a seat on the board. Something moved in his face. I didn't ask for one. I'm establishing the terms preemptively, she said. I've learned to do that. I know, he said, and the edge of something in his voice that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood as one. She leaned back in her chair and looked at him. Really looked, the way she'd been allowing herself to do more frequently in the weeks since the boardroom. Not assessing, not calculating, just looking at the actual person across the table, the full accumulated reality of him. The discipline and the damage. The 20 years of singular purpose and what that had cost the softer architecture of him. The places where people usually kept the things that made living feel like more than strategy. The way he sat in her kitchen at 11 in the morning drinking nothing because he'd made an excuse to be here that they both understood was an excuse. I told you to ask me again when it was over, she said. He went still. It's not entirely over. No, she said. It never is. But the part where I didn't know what I was standing on, that part is over. She held his eyes. Ask me. A moment. The long specific moment of a man who has spent 20 years being careful with everything and is about to be careful with nothing. I don't know how to do this, he said. I want to be honest about that. I have spent my adult life constructing situations and managing outcomes, and I do not know how to simply... He stopped. I am not good at this. I know, she said. I'm not asking you to be good at it. I'm asking you to try. He looked at her with the most undefended expression she'd ever seen on his face. More undefended than the hallway outside the operational room, more undefended than the boardroom, more undefended than any of the careful, honest things he'd said to her over the months of this. The expression of a person who has removed the last layer and is simply present, with all the awkwardness and exposure that being simply present involves. Then yes, he said, if that's available, then yes. She nodded. Once. Then she got up and poured his cold tea out and put the kettle on to make him a fresh cup, because that was a thing you did for a person you were going to try with. And the ordinariness of the gesture felt, after everything, like the most radical thing she'd done in a year of radical things. The foundation opened its doors 4 months later in a 3-room office in Mapogu that smelled like fresh paint and borrowed furniture. Zara had spent those 4 months doing the unglamorous work of building something real. Permits and legal registration, and hiring 2 staff members, and establishing the intake process, and having approximately 100 conversations she hadn't expected to have about what exactly this organization was, and who exactly it was for, and why exactly she was the right person to be running it. She was the right person because she'd been the wrong person in the wrong place for long enough that she knew every room of that house by feel. Ji-hyun came to work for the foundation 3 months in, which surprised Zara until Ji-hyun explained with characteristic directness that she had spent 8 years being very good at managing information for men who used it in ways she found increasingly difficult to justify, and she thought it was time to be very good at managing information for a different purpose. Zara hired her without deliberating. Cho Yun-ji became the foundation's legal counsel on a retainer that Zara suspected she'd accepted at a significant discount, though Cho Yun-ji had not confirmed this and Zara had not pressed. On the day the foundation opened, Zara stood in the small front office and looked at the modest framed mission statement on the wall. Plain language, no corporate flourish, just what they were and what they did and who they were there to help. And she thought about the night she'd stood on a sidewalk outside an iron gate in the rain with a broken-wheeled suitcase and 11% battery left. She thought about what she'd had then, what she'd been carrying that she hadn't known she was carrying, the legal claim, the history, the inheritance of a fight her father had started and never finished, the particular resilience that comes not from never being broken, but from understanding, deep in the bone, that being broken is not the same as being finished. She'd thought that night that her life was over. What it had actually been was the end of the wrong life. Min-jae came that evening, not to the opening. They had agreed, without discussing it explicitly, that his presence at the foundation's public face was something to be managed carefully, that his name attached to it too visibly created complications she didn't need. He came after, when the staff had gone and the borrowed folding chairs had been stacked and the modest refreshments cleared away. He came with no announcement, as he always did, and she heard his key in the lock, and she'd given him a key 3 weeks ago, another ordinary radical thing, and he came in and stood in the doorway of the front office and looked at the framed mission statement on the wall. He stood there for a long moment. "Your father would be, he started. "Don't," she said, not harshly. "Don't tell me what he would be. I didn't know him well enough. I didn't get the chance." She looked at the mission statement. "What I know is that what they took from him is worth something now. That's enough." He came and stood beside her. They looked at the wall together. The plain words, the simple stated purpose, the thing she'd built from the wreckage of the previous thing. "The third board member who resigned," he said. "The one in Busan. He's talking to the regulatory body's investigators. More than the self-disclosure covers." She processed this. "How much more?" "Enough that the criminal questions may reopen." She was quiet for a moment. "That's out of my hands." "Yes," he said. "It is." She thought about Mrs. Kwan, about whether justice looked like what she'd imagined it would look like from the sidewalk on that rain-soaked night, standing outside the iron gate. She thought about the answer, which was no. It didn't look like that. It looked like a board resolution and a regulatory filing and a third board member talking to investigators in Busan, and it was incomplete and imperfect, and it was what there was. She thought about the equity transfer, her father's name in the board resolution. The foundation with its 3 rooms and its borrowed furniture, and the first intake appointment scheduled for tomorrow morning with a Filipino woman who had been married to a Korean man for 11 years and had just found herself without documentation or support or anywhere to go. She thought about all of it. "I thought that first night," she said, "that the worst thing that could happen to me had just happened." Min-jae said nothing. He was listening in the way he listened, completely, without performing it. "It wasn't the worst thing," she said. "It was the necessary thing. That's different." She looked at him. "I wouldn't have found any of this, my father's history, the foundation, any of it, if they hadn't pushed me out that gate." She said it carefully, knowing what she was and wasn't saying. "I'm not grateful to them. I want to be clear that I am not grateful to them." "Understood," he said. "But I'm not destroyed by them either." She held his eyes. "That's what I mean." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to know best in him, not the contained professional precision of the early weeks, not the unguarded openness of the kitchen table, but the thing between those two, the look of a man who has built a very long career on understanding how things work and has recently encountered something he finds he cannot fully map, and has decided that the inability to map it is not a problem to be solved. He reached out and took her hand, not tentatively. He didn't do things tentatively, just took it, her hand in his, the way you take something you've decided to take care of. She let him. They stood there in the front office of the Whitfield Foundation in Mapogu, Seoul, with the mission statement on the wall and the borrowed furniture and the appointment on the books for tomorrow morning, and outside the city was doing what cities do, living its enormous indifferent life. 10 million people inside their own stories, none of them knowing about the woman who had stood in the rain 6 months ago with a broken suitcase and had decided, somewhere in the long cold walk from that iron gate to a hotel bed with a water-stained ceiling, that broken was not finished. She had been right about that. The gate had been the end of something, but she was still here, which meant she had work left to do, which meant the rest of it, the incomplete justice, and the imperfect man beside her, and the 3-room office, and the appointment tomorrow morning with the woman from the Philippines who needed someone to tell her that surviving the wrong life was not a failure, but a beginning. The rest of it was not epilogue. It was simply what came next. She had learned, finally, at 30 years old in a city that had taken things from her family and given them back changed and costly and real, to be someone who lived in what came next. Minjae held her hand. Outside, Seoul moved through another evening, and the river was there where it always was, and the lights on the bridges were the same lights they'd always been, and none of it cared about the particular woman standing in a small office watching the streetlights come on through a window, which was fine, Zara thought, which was exactly fine. She didn't need the city to care. She had enough of her own.